Hello, I'm Lisa Campion, and this is the Miracle of Healing on Empower Radio, where we come together every week to discuss all different kinds of healing. And I know that's something the world needs a lot of these days, maybe now more than ever, right? So if you're new to my show, I just want to give you a warm welcome. And if you've been journeying with us for a while, welcome back. What what would happen for you if you could experience the worst that life has to offer you, not by breaking down and freaking out, but by shifting up into a higher functioning, more highly awakened state? Well, that's something that our guest Steve Taylor has figured out how to do. And after many years of observing and studying the phenomenon of life-changing awakening through extreme suffering, psychologist Dr. Steve Taylor has coined the term transformation through turmoil. So join us now as we talk about how our struggles can lead us to a dramatic shift in this new expansive identity and lead to us to extraordinary awakenings. So welcome to the show, Steve.
Hi, Lisa. Great to be with you.
So, wow, I just felt like your book was so important. The work that you've done is so important in working out, seeing as trauma as a transformational experience and even a spiritually awakening experience. Can you talk a little bit about how you came even to be doing that kind of work?
It went back to an experience I had myself about 15 years ago. I was seriously ill for, fortunately, the only time in my life so far. And I was in hospital for about 3 weeks, very, very ill. But when I began to recover and when I realized I was going to be healthy again, I just felt this tremendous sense of gratitude. I felt like all my life I'd been taking my body for granted, but now I was really aware of how fantastic and how precious my body is, and how miraculous my body is. All of these incredible processes that take place to keep me healthy and alive. So it really changed my attitude to life. I felt as though I had a real sense of the meaning of life, the preciousness of life, and the fragility of life. I thought it was going to be a temporary thing, but it actually remained probably at a less intense level. It became a sort of permanent thing. I had this new sense of appreciation. So I began to investigate similar experiences in other people. And over the years, I did a few research projects and I developed the concept of transformation through turmoil based on the experiences I investigated.
Hmm. And it seems like in your work you can maybe divide people into two different groups. So we all have trauma pretty much. I've never met anybody that hasn't. Some people have more than others, but we can either let the turmoil, let the trauma that we have sort of crush us, right? And that does happen to some people. But you talk about how there are certain people that where that doesn't happen, where we don't get like destroyed. We somehow shift into something new where that trauma becomes like a initiation experience, if you will, into a
Yeah.
different
Mm.
state of awareness. So let's talk, when you call those people shifters, let's talk about the shifters for a minute. What's the difference? Like why does it sort
Mm.
of kill some
Mm.
people and other people shift?
Yeah, it's certainly a mysterious phenomenon that in some people, intense suffering gives rise to spiritual awakening, whereas in others it just seems to break them down.
Yeah.
Um, but for a small proportion of people, it's not just a breakdown, but also a shift up into a new state of awareness, a new state of being. And I did identify a few different factors. Partly it was connected to the attitude that people had towards their predicament, towards their trauma or their suffering. So if people, understandably, when some people face trauma, they don't want to face up to the reality of it. They try to divert themselves from it. They don't contemplate the full enormity of it. But, in order to experience transformation, people were willing to do that. They were willing to face up to the reality, no matter how painful it was. For example, I found cases of people who were diagnosed with cancer and underwent transformation.
Hmm.
And in almost every case, the beginning of the transformation was really contemplating the reality that they were possibly going to die and what that meant, losing everything and potentially losing everything, and being separated from all the people they loved. And then probably the most important stage after that was acceptance. People had to really open themselves up to the reality. They had to sort of embrace it in a strange way, in a paradoxical way. They had to really embrace their predicament, no matter how terrible it seemed. so to let go of any resistance. And that was often when transformation occurred, in a moment of acceptance.
Interesting. And what kind of transformation is possible? Like, what happens to the people that allow that to happen?
Well, it's a spiritual awakening, which is pretty much equivalent to, spiritual awakening as it's discussed in various spiritual traditions. So, I mean, one characteristic was a feeling of connection, a feeling of no longer being separate to the world. So people felt very connected to other people, very empathic and very altruistic towards other people. They felt connected to nature in a way that they never did before. So nature seemed really beautiful to them, and they felt as though they were part of nature.
Mm.
And also, they had a sense of appreciation, a bit like I described myself earlier. They were really aware of the beauty and the preciousness of being alive in the world, and the beauty and preciousness of other people. They no longer took things for granted. Basically, all of that
Wow.
kind of familiarity and taking for grantedness just faded away, and they just felt really grateful for the simple things in life. Just sort of eating and drinking and speaking to other people and looking at the sky. All of those simple things became really, really beautiful to them.
It feels like a sort of a radical shift into first mindfulness, so being fully aware in the moment, right? And sort
Hmm.
of universality. So this, transpersonal, like there's more than just it's more than just about me, right?
Yeah.
That can happen in gratitude, maybe gratitude for the moment. That seems like part of it too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely presence was important. People were no longer particularly interested in the future or the past. They
Mm,
were only really interested in the present moment. And the present moment became much more real to them. And yeah, there was a sense of gratitude just for the present moment, or whatever it may hold. You know, they were just grateful to be alive in the present moment.
it's
You
beautiful.
know,
And what kind of traumas were you looking at, and how did you find the people that you included in your research?
well, there's a wide variety of trauma. In a sense, the type of trauma isn't really that important. It seems to be, as long as the trauma is quite intense, then that seems to be, that was the catalyst for transformation. But
Mm,
I did meet some very interesting people in very unusual situations. For example, I found cases of soldiers who underwent transformation as a result of the stress and turmoil of warfare, and and the danger and the possibility of encountering death.
wow.
Also, prison. In fact, prison was one of the most fertile environments I found for transformation. I actually devoted 2 chapters. I had so many cases of prisoners who underwent transformation.
I love
I
the
devoted two
analogy you made
chapters.
between, or the
Oh, there's
connection
your
you made
cat.
between. Yeah, there's my cat. She's always here. But um, between prisoners and monks, like you kind of connected that, um, the the life in prison as being sort of a monastic experience, and that it has a lot of the same ingredients that monks who would go into seclusion would do to find their enlightenment, states of enlightenment.
That's right. Yeah, I mean they even both live in cells. The
Right?
monks live in cells as well. But yeah, there are some parallels. I mean, obviously, the big difference is that monks choose that life, whereas prisoners don't. They're thrown into that life against their will. But there are
Right.
certain parallels. I mean, another difference is that life in a monastery is much quieter, has much less turbulence than life in prison. But essentially, the essential similarity. Well, there are probably two things. One is that in prison, people have the opportunity for self exploration. In ordinary life, when life is busy and it's full of other people, it's full of activity, a lot of people just never really get the chance to enter their own being and
Right.
explore their own being. But in prison, when you're inactive a lot of the time, when you have a lot of solitude, you're forced to enter into your being, which you may never have done before. And obviously, for a lot of people, that's a very painful experience, because sometimes our own beings hold trauma, they hold psychological discord. But when some people take that opportunity to explore their own beings, they find something. They find a depth, they find a kind of a space inside themselves, which they were never aware of before. And they start to consider their own actions as well. They start to reflect about what they've done. They start to feel perhaps a sense of connection to other people, even to the victims of their crimes. But so that's one thing, that opportunity to self-explore. But probably the most important factor is that in prison, you're forced to let go of a lot of things.
Hmm.
Just like monks separate themselves from ambitions, possessions, relationships, society, and so on. In prison, you're also forced to let go, and that can have that can bring about a process of identity dissolution. Because your identity comes from the things you are attached to, the
Right.
things that you identify with outside the prison in your ordinary life. But in prison, without possessions, without your normal relationships, without your role in society, without your status, and so on, your identity can kind of crumble away,
Right.
which is painful for some people. But in other people, it can allow a new identity to emerge inside them, a kind of new spiritual identity.
It just occurs to me as you're talking about this that these are experiences that no one would actually willingly choose. you know
That's true.
like
Yeah.
we don't choose that. We don't choose a catastrophic illness or to be like totally messed up but for being a combat veteran. Like we don't choose those experiences, and yet they're the ones. I mean, I guess monks do, like, you know
Mm,
some
mm.
people do, but really the kind of experiences you're talking about for the most part are things that happen to us. Do you feel like there's
Exactly.
like a rhyme? Like why is that, like the hand of your own soul in your life, do you think, kind of giving you an opportunity for these extraordinary circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, it almost always happens spontaneously. I mean, you can obviously cultivate spiritual awakening. A lot of people do by following a spiritual practice, following a spiritual path,
Yeah.
and then it happens gradually over many years. But but it also happens accidentally and often quite suddenly and dramatically through intense suffering. And yeah, in some ways, probably the strangest thing about it was that in all of the people I interviewed, it was almost as if there was a spiritual self inside them which was already formed,
Hmm.
and it was just waiting for the opportunity to emerge. It was a bit like a chick which is ready to hatch from an egg. It's
Mm.
just it's fully formed. It's just waiting for the right moment to hatch. And it was a bit like this. It was almost as if there were two people. They were kind of this superficial ego self,
Right.
which they'd been for their whole lives previously, but at the same time, there was this latent, higher functioning spiritual self inside them. And and maybe subconsciously, people were attracting certain experiences to allow their egos to crumble away so
Right.
that this new self could emerge inside them. Possibly. I mean, I investigated a lot of cases of addiction when people, were severely addicted to drugs or alcohol for many years, and eventually their identity crumbled away. They lost everything,
Mm.
and maybe subconsciously they wanted to go through that process in order to destroy their egos, possibly.
Right. I mean, I feel like the grip of the ego is so strong on us that it's not going to really voluntarily choose to die very often.
No.
Like sometimes, you said like there are the monks or the yogis, and people who really dedicate themselves to spiritual practice, but these extreme examples, it's almost like we have to force the ego into such a extreme situation that it's got no choice but to let go.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. I mean, I think when people follow spiritual paths and practices, they're doing something similar in a very gradual way. They're
Mm.
slowly undoing the ego, slowly kind of softening the ego, so that it slowly dissolves away. But that doesn't always work, of course. But some people can practice meditation for decades, and it doesn't really seem to have much effect on them.
That's
But
right.
usually, it does. There is some sort of gradual effect of transcending the ego. But yeah, but in the experiences which I've investigated, it happens very suddenly and dramatically in the midst of trauma.
So I really like how you break down the idea of awakening experiences versus sort of the concept of enlightenment, because I think, or being fully awakened, we maybe in our minds we think, oh, we're going to have it's like turning on a light bulb. Like you turn it on once and you're illuminated forever after. And you talk about maybe it doesn't happen that way in your book. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I tend to avoid the word enlightenment because I think it suggests this kind of final, distinct state, which is completely distinct from ordinary awareness. But
Mm.
I think there's actually a continuum. There are lots of gray areas and gradations between normal awareness and enlightenment, or wakefulness, as I prefer to call it. So wakefulness is kind of, it occurs in different intensities. People can be slightly awakened, mildly awakened, or they can be very intensely awakened. And I think quite a lot of people exist in a kind of low intensity state of wakefulness. Maybe not so many people exist in a very intense state of wakefulness, but it is a continuum, and it's probably in that sense, it's probably more common than we think. Certainly, I'm always surprised at the examples I find. People write to me almost every week and say, "Oh, I've had this kind of experience that you're writing about. I
Hmm.
was diagnosed with cancer, I was addicted to drugs, etc." And in most cases, people went through this experience but didn't know anything about spirituality. They didn't know they'd become spiritually awakened because they didn't have a context to make sense of their experience.
Right.
So it was only later on when they began to read about spirituality, they thought, maybe I've become spiritually awakened. This sounds like me. So I think there are a lot of people around who are actually awakened but don't know it and have never actually shared it with anybody.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of a far cry from like the spiritual communities, or if you study Buddhism or yoga, then there's sort of a vocabulary for those processes. But um you know if you're not in that group, then that we don't have like a context or vocabulary. And I like it
Mm.
that you talk about gradations, because I think that's more realistic than the light bulb kind of moment that most people think it is.
Yeah, it can be a bit problematic as well. I think one of the issues I have with the concept of enlightenment is that it makes it sound like it's a very completely blissful and easy state.
Mm,
But in actual fact, it can be a difficult process. Quite a few people who go through spiritual awakening do go through a fairly difficult period of integration,
yeah.
especially if they don't understand what's happened because they feel confused. There was one guy I interviewed. He had an awakening in prison, and he didn't know anything about spirituality. So he thought that there was something wrong with him. He found a book of psychiatric conditions and
Wow.
started to look through the book, trying to find his condition. Luckily,
Mm.
he didn't find it, and he thought, "Wow, maybe there's not something wrong with me."
Oh, that's
So
so interesting.
yeah,
Wow.
then he found a book about spirituality and discovered, "Wow, this is what's happened to me. I've actually undergone an awakening."
And
But also, it can cause, when it's very dramatic, it can sometimes cause psychological disturbances,
yes.
problems with concentration, problems with socializing, and so forth.
Mm.
So, it can be a challenging process.
I think maybe people who've undergone that feel separated from the rest of other people, or isolated, or they don't maybe then fit into the rest of their old life so well, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It sometimes causes problems with relationships. It's
Yeah.
not uncommon for relationships or marriages to break up after these experiences because sometimes it's almost as if people become different people who are living in the same body.
Right.
So for their partners, it is literally as if they're married to a new person.
How
So it
interesting.
sometimes leads to breakdowns. Also friendships as well, because the person's old friends don't understand them anymore, and they often think that they've gone crazy, that there's something wrong with them. So yeah, it can cause problems in that sense too.
I know. I think there's a lot of like literature and studies that are written about, even um, depression as a side effect of this, or people who not only feel like they've gone crazy, but actually sort of do. Are there
Yeah,
people that don't take it well and kind of go off the deep end into real problems?
sometimes, but it's usually only temporary.
Mm.
I think the real problems arise when awakenings are very sudden and very dramatic. They can sometimes be like earthquakes. They can
Yeah.
be quite explosive. I guess that's a bit like a Kundalini awakening.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And sometimes it doesn't go well for people. They can go kind of
No,
nutty.
that's
Yeah.
true. But if they have support, and if they, you know, also maybe if they have therapy, then it does tend to, fade away after a certain amount of time. In fact, in every case that I've investigated, it has always faded away eventually. It's a bit like an earthquake in very, very slow motion. An earthquake disturbs the ground.
Mm.
Everything is thrown into disarray. But, slowly it settles again. And it's a bit like that. After this earthquake of spiritual awakening, there is often a very long period of settling and integration.
And do you make like a connection between people who have these types of traumatic experiences and people who have near death experiences? Is that part of the category that you studied?
Yeah. Well, near death experiences, they almost always have a very powerful transformational effect. But I talk about two kinds of near death experiences. There are near death experiences in a kind of literal sense when people just have a close encounter with death due
Right.
to an illness or a car accident and so forth. And there are the kind of classic near death experiences when people are dead for a short amount of time and then leave their bodies and float through darkness towards a light and sometimes meet deceased relatives and so forth. But both of those experiences are transformational, particularly the second kind.
Mm.
Even in real time, near death experiences may only last a few seconds, maybe a few minutes at the most, but people are fundamentally and deeply changed for the rest of their lives.
It's so interesting about this whole topic because I work primarily as a psychic, and I've been doing that since I was 19. And
Hmm.
now working professionally, way back then, before anybody was really doing it. And nowadays, I teach people psychic development. And I find there's a flood of people that are coming to me looking for, how to understand their psychic abilities because they've gone through things like you're talking about. And I wondered
Mm.
if you encountered um, an increase in psychic ability as part of the thing that happens when you have an awakening
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. There seems to be an increase in all kinds of like intuitive,
Mm.
creative abilities. People become more creative. For
Yeah.
example, one guy, excuse me, after his near death experience, started to compose symphonies and to paint
Wow.
to try to depict his experiences. Um, but yeah, people do sometimes report, developing almost telepathic abilities,
Hmm.
pr- sometimes precognition.
Yep.
So yeah, that is quite common.
The ones that I see are people who have had near death experiences, like the two kinds that you talked about, sometimes come back with the ability to speak to dead people. And almost
Mm,
all
mm.
mediums, some mediums are born with the gift, but many get it sort of midlife because it's connected with this brush they have with death.
Really?
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yep.
I found some cases where people, their transformation was related to bereavement,
Mm,
and their bereavement included contact with the person who they had lost,
right.
and that was
Yeah.
very powerful for them. And the contact did often continue, become an ongoing phenomenon.
Yes. Yeah, and that can really also change your perspective about life if you then have sort of proof that there's an afterlife. It can
Oh
really
yeah.
sort of open our minds to a new level of reality that we didn't maybe believe before.
That's right. Yeah, that was one of the things I found generally in my research was that even if their transformation wasn't related to bereavement or to a near death experience, people usually had an intuitive sense that there was more to life, that there was some kind of afterlife. And that, yeah, as
Mhm.
you say, in itself, that is enough to change your attitude to life. If you believe that there is something more and you believe that life is not just a temporary phenomenon in this form.
So, Steve, your work is so fascinating. Let's share with our listeners how they can reach you and find your book. So, let's take a look at your website. Do you work individually with people? Like, how are you working? How do you work with people?
I don't work individually. I do research involving interviews, but I'm a psychologist at university
Mhm.
part time, so I give lectures and do research at my university.
I see. Yeah. So, if people want to find out more about your research in the book your book, they can find you on your website here.
Yeah, that's right. That's the best place to go. Stephen M. Taylor.
Okay.
I write poetry and I write lots of essays, so a lot of them are on my website.
Great. And let's take a look at where people can find your book on Amazon too. So we can get a gander at what the cover looks like. And there it is on Amazon. Um, so I hope everyone who's listening can run right out and get your book, Extraordinary Awakenings, because I thought it was fascinating. I couldn't put it down. I was like up really late last night, like reading it because I was like, oh my God, it's so interesting.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I just totally
Thanks.
enjoyed it. And I want to get a hard copy of it because I was reading it on my Kindle, and I like to have a copy, so I'm gonna buy it. I'm gonna buy it myself and
That's
read it and
great.
then give it away because I just thought it was super cool. And as a psychic, I really love the research aspect of your book because most of my work and experience is like from my personal experience, and it hasn't been sort of done in a scientific way. So I just thought it
Hmm.
was very validating that the research you did, um, kind of just gives a little more credence or credibility to just like, well, some psychic said that's what happens. But here's,
Yeah, I
I
guess so.
like I like it that she did actual research because it's cool.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's nice
Yeah.
to hear.
Well, thanks so much for being on the show with us today. Fascinating stuff, and yeah, everyone should run right out and read your book. So thank you so much,
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Lisa. That was very enjoyable. Thank you.
and thanks all of you guys for who are watching and listening. You can find me on my website, lisacampion.com. I hope you stop by and say hi, and I just want to thank you all again for being with us today here on Empower Radio, where we are healing the planet one person at a time.